Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This is the session of the Green Growth Sustainable Development Forum about the energy efficiency and the built environment. So let me present myself first. As you can see in the screen, my name is Walid OUESLATI. I'm Senior Economist at the Environmental Directorate in the OECD. And I have today the pleasure to animate our session and our debate. Let me first give you three quick reminders. The first one, that the audience have interpretation service. So for the two official languages of the OECD, English, French. Also, the audience can post questions through the queue and answer questions in the software in Zoom. And the other reminder that I want to tell you is about, yes, there's you will receive a participant survey about the outcome of the forum. So please feel free to fill in it and let us know what is your assessment of the overall work of this forum. So this session, let me first say few words as introduction. So as many of you know, that a third of greenhouse emissions are generated by building sector. The sector play and probably will play a major and central role in the overall effort in cutting down CO2 emissions in the future. This is why the policy discussion, the policy action to curb these trends are very important, and this will be the most important part of our discussion today. There's many levels of policy action for that. So, you know, there's the house design per se, which is very important, about the insulation, the orientation of the house, and many aspects relate to the physical characteristics of the house and its location. Also, how we operate the house, so all the energy efficient equipments, then how we monitor the energy consumption, if there's any smart meters that the consumer can follow their consumption, but also the nudging household and changing behavior, that people adopt more, how we say, saving more energy in their house. However, the pandemic imply many changes that we were able to see in the last few months. So first, more people stay home with the lockdown policy applied here and there. So means maybe more energy consumption. There's also, in the same time, in parallel, avoided emission, because avoided emission for commuting, for instance, and that's could offset in certain extent the increase in energy consumption in house. There's also other things that we talk about, but still may be specific in some countries, is that many people left the city center and go to suburban area or countrysides. That's something happens in many European countries, for instance. There's also increase in energy consumption through the extensive use of IT, like internet and like Zoom and many other softwares. So this session mainly will deal with three questions related to this context. First, how did the COVID pandemic affect the energy use in buildings, and with what implication for carbon emissions? Second, what barriers can undermine the joint objective of energy efficiency improvements and economic growth pursued by green recovery measures? Third, how can we ensure that policies to promote a more sustainable energy use in the building sector also contribute to addressing energy poverty? That's the three questions. And to discuss around the three questions, I have the pleasure to present the participants. So first, our scene setter, Brian Motherway, in my right. He is head of Energy Efficiency Division at the International Energy Agency. We have also Hans van Steen, advisor to the Director of Just Transition, Consumers, Energy and Efficiency and Innovation at the European Commission. We have also the pleasure to have with us Mónica GASMURI del CURTO, Director of ANESCO in Chile. Welcome, Mónica. We have Professor Arik LEVINSON, a Professor of Economics at Georgetown University at the United States. And in my left, my colleague Atshunito OSHIMA, Senior Policy Analyst at the OECD. So welcome to all of you. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Brian to set the scene. Brian.
Thank you, Walid. Thank you, Kumi, for the invitation, and hello to all my fellow panelists and to everybody joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with some colleagues here in the room and with other friends and colleagues on the Zoom and participating together. Thank you for the opportunity to do a little scene setter for this very interesting discussion today, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists. And today's discussion is timely for two reasons. First of all, COP has just completed its work, and in the COP decision we saw for the first time a very specific call for governments to scale up their work on energy efficiency as part of their climate responses. And it's also for me and my colleagues very timely today because just this morning we launched the latest edition of our annual Energy Efficiency Market Report, Energy Efficiency 2021, which, if I can plug, is available online right now at iea.org, and we'd welcome you looking at that report and giving us your feedback on it. So it gives me a chance to give you really the literal latest data on the progress globally around energy efficiency. So let's have a look at that. If I could view my slides, please. First of all, if we track the overall progress in energy efficiency, and we do this by measuring the primary energy intensity of the global economy, in other words, how much energy does it take per unit of GDP to power the economy, we get a little bit better each year, so we do see some improvements. 2020 was a perturbation for many understandable reasons. In 2021, we see a return to the 10-year trend, which is the global economy will improve its efficiency by about 2%. That's good news compared to 2020, but it's not where we need to be. And particularly when you compare it to the IEA's net zero by 2050 scenario, we need to very quickly double that global progress. We need to see a move to around 4% annual improvement in energy intensity, which is very possible based on cost-effective available measures, but we're not seeing the trend moving fast enough in that direction. We do see some green shoots in terms of investment. We see some progress in terms of investment in energy efficiency, both in stimulus responses in many parts of the world and in overall energy efficiency trends, about 10 or 20% lift this year, particularly in buildings, which is something we're going to discuss today. But I have to say that's driven by a small number of specific economies, including one or two countries here in Europe where they've made a lot of additional money available for investment in buildings. It's not necessarily reflective of a positive global trend. It is notable, though, that when we look at those countries that have announced stimulus measures focused on clean energy, which is a substantial, though not as substantial as we'd like to see, sector, we see a lot of countries making a degree of linkage between economic recovery and clean energy investment. And it's notable that 2/3 of those announcements and those policy commitments relate to energy efficiency. And this reflects, I think, what is an important point, particularly in these times, which is clean energy generally is jobs intensive, but energy efficiency is particularly jobs intensive. In terms of whether it's public or private investment, the amount of jobs you can create per €1 million, per $1 million is relatively high in energy efficiency because it's in sectors like construction, in industry, in infrastructure, places where job intensity is quite good. And so clean energy efficiency offers that kind of added bonus, if you like, to governments looking to align clean energy responses and investment in clean energy systems of the future with short-term goals such as economic stimulus and job creation. So we have been looking in some detail about the effectiveness of policies, and I can give you one example which relates to the building sector, which is the appliances we use in those buildings. This is a key area of growing energy demand in every part of the world, particularly in emerging and developing nations, where appliance ownership is becoming more available to people as income goes up. And key technologies like air conditioners, refrigerators, other technologies are really key to shaping the curve of the future of electricity demand, as more and more people get access to these devices. And when they buy them, they either buy efficient ones which lock in better services, more affordability, lower emissions, or less efficient technologies which lock in the exact opposite. So it's important to note that when we look particularly at the longest term measures, which tend to be countries that have regulated for higher standards of efficiency, countries that have put in place minimum energy performance standards for televisions, for electronics, for refrigerators, and the economies that have done that over several decades, we see a very significant and welcome shift towards more efficient devices. So those economies that have had minimum performance standards for appliances in place for several decades are now seeing efficiency gains of more than 50%, which means consumer bills are going down substantially, and probably even more importantly, the cost of these technologies is not going up. When we look at the global data set, we see that these typical devices are going down in purchase price by 2 or 3% every year, while also becoming more efficient. So consumers gain from lower purchase costs as well as lower running costs, and overall the energy system gains, and of course the climate gains. So we see that policy does work. Now, around the world, there's about 120 countries that either have such policies in place or are putting them in development. A lot of them are relatively new, so they don't feature in the numbers yet because it takes some time for those policies to really have an effect. But we see tremendous opportunity for continuation and indeed strengthening of these types of policies around the world. Now, when we look at the road to net zero, certainly as mapped out by the IEA's net zero scenario, we see that energy efficiency is really crucial. And it's particularly crucial in the first decade because leading with energy efficiency makes the transition to net zero more affordable, less costly, and just less substantial in scale because we create an energy system that's more efficient. We need less energy infrastructure, we need less energy supply because we can manage demand through greater levels of efficiency. And in fact, looking at the 2030 milestone, we could see an economy that has grown by more than 40% in GDP terms, but actually uses less energy than today because of the gains in energy efficiency. And that's why it's important to see energy efficiency as a key early focus for net zero transitions that so many governments are now looking to. I just want to mention two cross-cutting themes that I think are really important. First is the digital transformation of the energy system. Driven by the availability of digital devices, we're really seeing a different way of thinking about how electricity systems in particular operate. It's no longer supply over here, demand over here. It's no longer very centralized monolithic systems. We're seeing much more dynamic, interactive, decentralized systems, which make the demand side much more important in terms of being able to flex demand so that demand can be higher when clean, cheap resources like wind and solar are available, but demand can be controlled at other times of the day, of the week, of the year. And what's enabling that, of course, is the penetration of digital technologies. And this year, for the first time in 2021, we've reached the point where there are more connected devices on the planet than there are people, particularly driven by everything from connected appliances at home, but in particular things like smart meters, connected sensors, Internet of Things type devices. And so this is becoming a real crucial arena for changing the way we think about energy efficiency and clean energy, particularly in the context of grids. This is a major focus of our work at the IEA. And particularly this year, we've been delighted to work very closely with the government of Italy, who have been the president of the G20 group this year, and asked us to produce some new analysis on the role of smart cities and smart grids in the clean energy transition so that we can think about digital technologies really supporting a new way of thinking about energy efficiency and clean energy transitions. And we're working very closely with governments around the world to look at the kind of policy responses that are necessary to avail of the opportunities that come from digitalization, but also address the challenges and risks, whether it's cybersecurity, resilience questions, data privacy, and other questions that governments need to proactively handle through better policy and regulation as we move forward. The second cross-cutting theme I want to mention before I close is people. We sometimes end up in these conversations about energy efficiency talking about insulation and building fabric and appliances and forgetting the most important aspect, of course, which is people. It's always there in the back of our minds, but maybe not as explicit as it should be. And we always say in the IEA that all clean energy transitions are for people and about people. They're about mitigating the worst effects of climate change. They're about improving the quality of people's lives, creating the jobs of the future, mitigating for people who might lose their jobs. All of these social dimensions are at the center of our clean energy transitions thinking. And for that reason, earlier this year, our Executive Director, Fatih Birol, convened the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions. It brought together energy climate ministers from around the world, heads of state, thought leaders in the labour sector, in youth, in civil society, to really think about the best practice in making clean energy policies really inclusive, people-centered, and benefiting the most people, and also, therefore, the most likely to succeed. So the Commission made its recommendations just a couple of weeks ago in advance of COP, where they made 12 key action recommendations across the themes of employment, social and economic development, equity, inclusion, and public participation. The recommendations, as well as a bank of case studies to support the evidence, are all available on our website. And I was pleased to say that these recommendations featured in a number of ministerial discussions in COP, and we are taking these discussions forward with our members and with governments around the world to really make sure that policies are aligned with keeping people on board, making sure people benefit the most as possible, and making sure that policies remain inclusive and therefore likely to succeed. So there's a big agenda here. I guess my core message as the STEEN setter today is the mantra energy efficiency first remains. The IEA calls energy efficiency the first fuel, and I think you can see that if we don't treat it as the first fuel, particularly as we accelerate our transitions towards net zero energy systems, we won't succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. That's a great presentation, very interesting, all these trends. I would like just to give you two thoughts. The first one is about what you said. I think it's very interesting ideas that energy efficiency sector and all the investment can have an economic dividend, which is more related to the creation of new jobs, etc. So do we have any assessment of the importance of the second dividend, which is the environmental dividend, and how this can be presented as a complement to the economic one?
I think a key issue is not just how we get to net zero by 2050, but what is the path we face, and particularly locking in higher levels of emissions now. And as many economies start to recover, they will build a lot. There will be a lot of new homes built, offices built, a lot of infrastructure built. And most of that will still be with us, of course, in 2050. So we have a real question now about locking in either efficiency or inefficiency, high carbon or low carbon. And particularly in terms of energy demand, just to use that, we could see the world become more than a third more energy efficient in this decade through a focus on energy efficiency. And to answer your question then, Walid, in terms of the environmental dividend, IEA's net zero pathway, driven in particularly in this decade by efficiency, electrification, the role of behavior change, plus a number of other supply side measures, could see the global economy become almost 40% less carbon intensive by the end of this decade alone on a global scale. Clearly, it varies in different parts of the world. But there's a real chance now to lock in lower carbon, which not only talks about emissions of the future, but gives us some headroom space. There are economies that can move faster than others. The more we reduce emissions here and now, the more space we have in the global accounting for emissions. So I think it's really important, the early action point.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just point about the final point is about the digital transformation. That's very interesting. Do we have any assessment about all the energy consumption due to this intensive use of internet and
We do. We've been looking at this. The data is still emerging because it's an emerging sector. But when we look at the opportunities for saving on the one hand, like things like smart home energy management or energy management systems for buildings like this, the results that are coming in are showing savings 20, 30% in terms of savings. The energy demand of those devices is still relatively small. In terms of data centers, cloud, all that kind of thing, it's still only a couple of percent of global energy use. So right now, the gains far outstrip the energy demand costs. Now, it's something we need to watch because obviously data centers and data management, the cloud sector has been growing really, really fast. What's been interesting in the last few years is the efficiency gains in that sector, the efficiency gains in servers, in data centers, etc., have been massive. So far, energy demand has been relatively flat because despite the growth in activity, efficiency gains have kind of cancelled that out. There's a big question and maybe a degree of doubt as to whether that can continue. We expect the growth in activity to continue apace. Whether the efficiency gains can continue at the same pace do raise important questions. Right now, I would certainly say that the global gains from digitalization in energy efficiency far outweigh the energy costs, but it is certainly a space we need to watch.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. So, Brian, you will have the opportunity maybe when we come to the question and answer to that again. But let's go now, continue on discussion with our other panelists. So the idea just each one from his experience, his research, and his current concerns that he can reflect on different questions. So I would like to invite first Hans van Steen from DG for Energy, European Commission. Hans, could you tell us more about the role of energy efficiency in the European Union recovery and European Union climate strategy with the focus on buildings?
Yes, thank you very much, Walid, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you, including my fellow panelists. And thank you very much, Brian, for this excellent scene setter. And I think a lot of the things that you said, we very much subscribe to here in the Commission. And I look forward to reading in more detail the report that you mentioned that just came out today, which I think sounds like a very important milestone on energy efficiency. So from the European Commission side, it's very clear, I hope, for most people that everything that we do these days is really trying to implement the European Green Deal that came out very early on during the mandate of this Commission in 2019, just before the pandemic really hit us in Europe. And of course, the headline target of the European Green Deal is the ambition to become climate neutral by the middle of this century, by 2050. This objective has, by the way, now been endorsed by all the member states in the European Union and is now a legally binding obligation through our European climate law. So that is all fine. But what is also very important to see is that this European Green Deal is much more than just about climate change. It is actually a growth strategy for the EU, because while it's clear that the pandemic has had very profound impact on the energy sector in many, many ways, it also presents us with a very, very good opportunity, because one way of getting out of this crisis that has followed the pandemic is investments. And these investments have to be investments in the right things. And one of those right things to invest in our view, is energy efficiency, among other things, for the reasons that Brian mentioned about job intensity, that in fact, for every euro, dollar, or whatever currency one uses, invested in energy efficiency, the impact in terms of welfare and jobs is very, very high. So for that reason, we believe that energy efficiency has to be a cornerstone of the recovery from the pandemic. Buildings in particular are important because buildings are about 40% of our energy consumption in the EU. There's a very, very important potential for becoming more efficient in our energy use in buildings. In every aspect of this, heating, of course, is very important, but also the appliances that Brian also mentioned. And all of that is covered by European legislation, and a lot of that legislation is being reviewed, in fact, as we speak. Because in connection with our ambition to become climate neutral by the middle of the century, by 2050, it's also very clear that in order for that to be realistic, we need to be more ambitious also on the short term by 2030. And there we had before agreed already to cut our emissions by 40%, but it was clear that that was not on the right trajectory towards climate neutrality. So it is now agreed that we need to achieve a 55% reduction of carbon or CO2 emissions by 2030. And that, of course, means we need to be more energy efficient. We need to deploy more renewables by that date. And that requires new legislation. So we're reviewing our legislation, for example, on buildings, on energy efficiency more generally, but also on things like renewable energy, because, of course, renewable energy also holds an important key towards reducing the carbon impact of energy use in buildings by deploying more renewables in the building sector. So there's a lot of very, very important things going on in the European Union. We're in a hurry because 2030 comes up very quickly. So we want to have this agreed as soon as possible. And of course, we count on the member states and the European Parliament to help us get to where we need to be in order to reduce our carbon footprint from buildings. Very, very important in our view. I'll maybe leave it there, but come back to some of the details later on, if I may, Walid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. Let's leave Europe and see another area in the world. I would invite Mónica from Director of UNESCO in Chile. So, Mónica, can you tell us more about the role of ESCO in promoting energy efficiency, just for non-expert point of view? Huh? So, and if you have already are you considering any green recovery measures? What are the challenges and opportunity from your point of view? Please.
Thank you for the opportunity to express a part of what is our situation. First of all, we know that energy efficiency and the renewables energies are the main pillars of carbon neutrality here also in Chile. When new energies will replace, these new energies will replace the conventional and fossil energies, while energy efficiency will produce the change to use the energy to a smarter, more responsible and more technology use. We have goals for the pass out coal by 2050 with important advances for 2030, and this will require more efficient consumption. Today, we know how much we produce, but we do not control the consumption, and we don't know how much we can avoid the consume. Also, for more renewables and for the development of green hydrogen here in Chile, we will need improve our transport and distribution system. And all this will be possible only if we start with energy efficiency. Guarantee the entry of that clean energy and bring it to the user will depend on energy technology, energy efficiency technology to better manage and greater precision. In Chile, the public policy has been always reticent to promote energy efficiency or unambitious of its potential. After many interventions by ANESCO Chile, a 35% of the contribution was recognized in the conquest of carbon neutrality. But in the beginning was in the roadmap was only 7%. We all know that in global is at least around 50%. All what I wanted to say with all this, that in Chile, energy efficiency depends really of the people who really believe in energy efficiency and its impact. In 2017, for example, we have a market closer than $300 million. The same impact of in the new law and the new energy law, the same power decrease. So what our members in ANESCO Chile, all these companies offer is really more than sits and it's said in the law. The companies in ANESCO Chile are responsible for showing the results. They made the investment, studies, audits, measurements, and verification of results in their own efforts. When we put all the part of the solution from finance to the results in the same service offer, we talk about the ESCO model, so energy efficiency companies. This model has allowed us not only to show the attributes for energy efficiency, but also to for the produced world, a tool to fight the climate change. Because there are companies willing to make a real change because their own compromise with their own results, money, work, time on it. Yeah. So the energy efficiency law, I will tell you, says not word about ESCO. Also, they are not included in a new program of helping industry after the social conflict here in Chile or after the COVID-19 consequences. Even more, in some programs, they explicitly ruled out ESCO model. So to finish, energy efficiency, ANESCO model here in Chile is pushed by ANESCO Chile the more of the time, and our members to recover industry in economically. An example in buildings, existing buildings, retrofits, need our multidisciplinary experts, and we have a lot to do, especially in thermal power optimization for real transition. Our consume is almost 80% thermal, so we have a lot to do on that and that thing, especially in buildings.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Now, we will change a little bit the kind of question that we have. Brian was talking in his last point about equity and the justice that we should have when it comes to energy policy, energy efficiency policies. I would invite Professor Atkinson. Professor LEVINSON, maybe can you tell us more about the distributional consequences of energy efficiency policies?
Sure. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Let me start by providing two quick reactions to Brian's very clear and focused scene setting. One is about jobs. I wonder if we are putting jobs on the wrong side of a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, in a well-working labor market, in a tight labor market like we have in the United States right now, where the unemployment rate is below 5% and has recently been below 4%, jobs employed in climate mitigation are displaced from other useful activities. And so counting jobs as a benefit is putting them on the wrong side of a cost-benefit analysis. And the second is the focus on energy efficiency. Shouldn't we be focused on carbon efficiency rather than energy efficiency? In other words, in some future when the grid is electrified and all people's is renewable and all people's homes are electrified, why then would we care about energy efficiency? If I have solar panels on my roof and my home is cooled by electric air conditioners powered by the solar panels, why would I not use as much energy as I want and it's not a social issue? So if it's not jobs and it's not energy efficiency, then what should we be focused on? Economists have been singing the same song for 100 years. We should put a tax on carbon. We should put tax on pollution, in this case, a carbon tax or auction off permits. Why don't we do that? Well, as Walid suggested, one of the chief objections is that carbon tax would be inequitable because the burden falls disproportionately on low-income households. And that's true in a narrow technical sense. But the claim is misleading for a couple of reasons. One is well known, which is that it ignores what we do with the revenues from a carbon tax. If we imposed a carbon tax and directed the revenues towards low-income neighborhoods, low-income communities, we could make that carbon tax as progressive as we like. But the second is less well known. It ignores what we do instead of a carbon tax. Energy efficiency standards turn out not only to be less cost effective than a carbon tax, they're also worse for low-income families. Let me give you an example. Last time I looked at window air conditioners, the things that go sit in the windowsill, it cost about $70 more to buy the efficient one than an equivalent but less efficient air conditioner. What does that $70 buy? It buys lower operating costs, as Brian suggested. The efficient one cost about 20% less per unit of cooling. So if you plan to do a lot of cooling, to use the unit a lot, it makes sense to spend the extra $70 and buy the efficient air conditioner. If you plan not to do much cooling, then that extra $70 doesn't make personal financial sense. Rich people use more cooling, poor people use less, so rich people buy the energy efficient units and poor people buy the inefficient units for good personal sensible reasons. A requirement that everybody buy efficient air conditioners or that manufacturers only sell efficient air conditioners would be a disproportionate burden on low-income households. Now, you might object that countries are subsidizing energy efficiency for low-income households by giving them tax credits or lowering the price of those products for low-income households, but that's just using a fiscal tool to change the regressivity of the policy. And that's exactly the same thing that we could do with a carbon tax by redirecting the revenues. And in fact, it's easier in the case of a carbon tax because there's an obvious source of those revenues. So the bottom line is energy efficiency standards turn out to be not only more costly and achieve less in terms of carbon mitigation than a carbon tax would or auctioned permits, they also turn out to be worse for low-income households. Thanks.
Thank you, Arik. Thank you very much. I remember one story about the link between renewable energy and energy efficiency when it comes, for instance, to make insulation. We know that even if we have solar energy in the winter, that we don't have enough. So energy efficiency could be a complement for the renewable energy. That's just an example, just to show how it's complementary. Before we will come back to this discussion about the distributional effect. I think it's a major and important point of this session. But let's switch a little bit the topic. Now, we were talking till now about policy, national policy, sectoral policy, but we know how important is the role of local authorities and subnational levels of energy efficiency. And here I would like to invite my colleague in my left, Atshunito, to tell us more about the supranational and subnational government perspective.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I will briefly talk about what are the key challenges and why cities and regions are important in around three points. First, existing buildings. I will mainly talk about buildings. So policy tend to focus on new construction because it's easier to apply higher levels of energy efficiency standard. However, annual construction only account for 1% of entire building stock in OECD countries. If we only rely on new construction, it takes many years to renew all the building stock. Furthermore, old buildings are much less energy efficient than new buildings. So in case of insulation, buildings built before 1945 is 5 times less energy efficient than the buildings built after 2010. So, and we have a lot of, policy measures to improve energy efficiency. For example, building energy code. But in our survey, many cities and regions still apply building energy codes to only new buildings. So how to scale up energy efficiency and probably energy efficiency renovations. This is a huge challenge for achieving energy efficiency in buildings. Second, territorial disparity. So energy consumption and carbon emissions differ across cities and regions. So, for example, building account for 70% of carbon emissions in cities like Paris, London, or Tokyo. So this is much greater than global average of 30%. And in OECD countries, typically per capita home energy consumption is 3 times higher in the region with highest consumption than in the region with the lowest consumption. So there is a significant territorial disparity within a country. And also building itself is differing across cities and regions. Climatic conditions, percentage of old building stock, percentage of multifamily housing, new construction rates, these factors all differ across cities and regions. And also we shouldn't forget about housing affordability. Housing affordability issue is severe, especially in some metropolitan areas. So we need to consider these territorial disparities in promoting building decarbonization. Finally, key roles of cities and regions. So first, cities and regions can factor in these local and specific elements. Second, they have their own public buildings, and they can leverage public building investment to upscale the building decarbonization. So for example, subnational buildings account for 20% of non-residential building stock in France and 30% in Japan. So it's a huge percentage, and they can leverage that public building investment. Third, cities and regions can explore effective and ambitious regulations. So, many cities and regions are in charge of zoning regulations, and also some cities and regions are in charge of building energy codes too. And for example, the city of New York introduced a very ambitious climate mobilization act to cap the carbon emissions from large existing buildings. So, these are the 3 points. Now, cities, despite their very strong potential, cities and regions are facing major difficulties and important governance gaps, like insufficient budget, lack of technical expertise, or lack of monitoring framework. So I think the key is how to engage and support cities and regions and in order to decarbonize buildings. Thanks.
Thank you, Atshunito. That's very relevant, the local level in terms of energy policy. Now, just a reminder for the audience, please go ahead and ask your question on the Q&A section in your screen. I would be happy to share your question with our panelists. I would like to come back to our question first, main question, which is more related on the COVID pandemic, how this affect energy use and in buildings, and what are the implications on carbon emissions. Actually, one question that which is recurrent, that today we don't know if it's a permanent effect or just temporary effect that will go with all this measures that we have. We know that people stay more in home, because they are teleworking and there is more flexibility in some sectors, not for everyone, obviously. And there's also, at least last year, we observed a decrease in car use and related emission to commuting. That's something, as one panelist said, yesterday. That was we finally feel the air clean because there's less cars in the streets, etc. So we observe many things. However, we know we are not at the end of this pandemic. That would need more time and more data to see where we are exactly. But my main question here, do you think in terms of energy consumption, my question is for you, Brian, if there's a change in the behavioral pattern, is that something that we can observe? And what would be the implication for all our projections related to the net zero energy consumption?
I think, even though it might be the disappointing answer, I think the effect is small, to be honest. I think that certainly when we look at transport data, commuting data and things like that, there's been a very substantial bounce back. And you see it in air pollution statistics as well, by the way. And we do see more commuting from home, but its energy implications are relatively small. Bigger things like the revivification of industry, particularly large intensive industries like steel and cement, swamp that very much. So in terms of overall energy stats, the questions as to whether we'll all work from home a little bit more, commute a little bit less, are relatively small. I mean, bigger impacts might come from, for instance, if what happens with the future of long distance air travel and things like that. But so far, I'm not particularly optimistic that we have kind of reset the way we do things in terms of our lifestyles. And in fact, to be honest, looking at a global level, energy demand is rising very quickly in 2021. It'll almost completely wipe out the energy demand fall we saw in 2020. And in fact, energy-related emissions will grow in 2021 year on year, the second highest single-year increase in the last 40 years. So I'm not particularly optimistic that we have kind of somehow reset things. Walid, do you mind if because I have the floor just for a second to come back to a couple of Arik's points, because he did kind of address them to me, and I'm interested in his perspective, but he won't be surprised if I don't entirely agree with all of the points he made. First of all, on the jobs question, I hear the point from the point of view of an economy like the US where employment is very high. But if you look at it globally, just to take a simple example, South Africa has more or less 50% unemployment. And the question of there where investment goes towards more, sectors that drive more local employment like construction and industry versus spending it on imported technologies or whatever else are really key questions. So I think looking at it globally, the story is quite different. On the question of why efficiency when we're moving towards low carbon, and Arik gives an example of putting a solar panel on his roof. My simple answer is, how many solar panels do we need? How many wires? How many wind turbines? And if the global economy is twice as efficient, which it could be in the coming decades, the amount of critical minerals we'll need, the amount of steel we'll need, the amount of land we'll need for clean energy supply clearly more or less halves as well. And I think we just need to look at the overall cost of this transition, which is a very significant one. Finally, on the point about the price of appliances, I mean, it's an important point to monitor, and we have to watch the distributional effects very well. What I want to say is it's important not to look at price differentials in a static way, just in terms of what are the different prices in a market today, because what we see in the data globally is that policy can shift the price dynamics. And in countries where they raise efficiency standards, the manufacturers respond in terms of their portfolio pricing. The better technologies get more economies of scale. They become the standard device rather than the luxury device, and we do see the prices come down. So well-designed policies can protect against the distributional effects and lead to this win-win for consumers where they're getting more efficient technologies, not necessarily at a higher cost.
Thank you, Brian. So one also the question that comes to my mind when I was listening to the Hans presentation. Hans, so in your perspective, what would be the main barriers to implement the objectives of this European Union agenda in terms of energy efficiency?
I think that's a very, very important point, because of course, since a lot of the energy efficiency is actually cost effective and is still not happening, that can only be because there are some barriers out there that prevent these investments from being made or these actions being taken and so on and so forth. So I think there are some really important barriers that needs to be addressed via policy or in other ways. And some of these we've been actually dealing with for quite some time. I mean, if we're looking specifically at buildings, I think one very important barrier is finance. I mean, we need to make sure that finance is available, that people can go to the bank and they can actually get possibilities of getting private finance in order to do a renovation of their building, which is energy efficient and goes much deeper than what we've seen so far. One of the things that we said with the so-called renovation wave strategy that came out last year is that we need to accelerate and we need to double the rate of the number of buildings that are being renovated every year. That means basically that we need to renovate 35 million buildings in the EU between now and 2030. So that's really a lot, and that of course requires a lot of finance. Some of it will come from public funding, and we're really, so we say, ramping up possibilities to finance these things also from the EU budget. But even with that, it's quite clear that a lot of it will have to come from private finance. So that's one clear barrier, and we're addressing that. We're working much more closely with the private sector and the financial sector than we have in the past, and we're beginning to see some real important results of that cooperation. So we're quite optimistic on that. Another barrier is clearly information, that it's not always simple for people to know what to do in order to actually renovate their buildings. We have building certificates, but these are not always implemented in a very clear and straightforward way. We want this to be more, shall we say, standardized, harmonized across the EU. We would also like to have something like building passports, which clearly explains to people what kind of actions they can take in order to bring their house or their apartment up to a better standard of energy efficiency. These are some of the things that we're looking at now with the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that hopefully will come out before the end of this year. So I think these are some of the really important barriers. There are others as well, things like skills. The people who have to do the renovation, let's face it, we are not all handymen to the extent that we can do these things ourselves. You need to bring in the trade, and very often you get people in who are perhaps not used to look specifically at the possibilities to have energy efficiency improvements as part of that. So there are many barriers that can be dealt with. Energy poverty, we've discussed a little bit. I mean, obviously, if you are among the energy poor, and in some member states in the EU, it's quite a big proportion of the population that can be defined as energy poor. If you have the opportunity to invest, it might not be energy efficiency first. So you need to look at how can we persuade these people to do it, and that will probably require some kind of finance instruments. We're creating the so-called EU Social Climate Fund that will hopefully bring available money from the emission trading scheme to support these type of things in the future, and that will be, I think, very, very important. Can I just say,
yes, please.
If I still have one second, I agree actually very much with what Brian said also on the issue about energy efficiency versus, shall we say, low carbon. We believe from the Commission side that also when we have an energy supply that is much lower in terms of carbon content, energy efficiency will remain important. In fact, all our analysis that we've done for our proposals show that unless we become more energy efficient, it will not be possible to achieve climate neutrality in a cost-effective way anytime soon, and certainly not in the time perspective that we're looking at. To sort of assume that once we are all, so we say, renewable or carbon neutral in terms of energy supply, we don't need to worry about energy efficiency. In our view, is not the right way to go. So I think on that point, we agree very much with what Brian said. I'm losing my voice, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Something come to my mind when I was listening to you on other possible barriers to renovate like buildings is when you have many owners in the building, and sometimes you can see the unequal incomes between different people in the same building, and this make them not to be very happy, very able or keen to participate to any program of renovation. There is some experience in different cities. I think in Paris it's already the case that they try to have a program that can help low-income people and living in the same building, that they can be committed in the same program. That's something very important to take in consideration. Now, continuing on the barriers, I would like to ask Mónica, what's this barriers from the private sector view? What would be in Chile the main barriers to implement energy efficiency program, but from the point of view of this private sector?
Yeah, what I can tell you from the private sector, or what we were learning in this time, that the transactional logistic must be finished. We don't sell light bulbs. We offer best illumination, for example. We need to advance in a consultative relationship focused on service. We need to support and promote new business model like ESCO model. Rehabilitation will need technical maturity without limits, as was here in Chile, for example, renewables energies. As ANESCO, we believe that we need really an ESCO model for doing energy efficiency as a rule. And it's complex, but we need experts with a special motivation and good results in tailor-made solutions. ESCO model, for example, it's a consultant model, tailor-made, virtuous, and commitment with a long-term services. So what we need to help this private sector and the energy efficiency industry that is small, but we are doing the change. Yeah, we need a political policy or best financial product to make grow up the ESCO model, to make sure that the banks and clients make their own best sustainable decision, better solutions. I do not sell a product. We make your company works. This is something that we are trying to sell and to show in the industry. And the clients in the industry are our best commercial manager at the moment. And so what at the same time, we are trying to give a complete solution, and the results will show exactly what we are trying to tell the market, you know. So this, all in all, what we were learning from the private sector, that we need a complete integral service, and to see the results to impact all the rest of the market, or the rest of the sector, that they are not seeing solution in energy efficiency.
Okay, thank you. Arik, I have a question regarding the feasibility, or the let me say social acceptability of those measures, and what would be the role of carbon pricing and carbon revenue recycling to address these issues.
I think you're asking a political economy question,
yes,
which might be, I don't have a license to practice political economy. So what's feasible and what's practical, I don't know. I will say that two things. One is that that a lot of social policies that I thought would have been impossible 2 decades ago have been enacted in the United States today. And so things are only impossible until they happen, and then they're possible. And so I wouldn't rule out a price on carbon just because it hasn't happened. It's happened in a lot of places in the world, and an increasing number of places in the world. And that carbon price is probably too low in most places, but in many places it is growing. Second, there are a lot of political scientists who argue that, you know, once a carbon tax and people have argued for a carbon tax and a dividend. You've seen these proposals. We collect a carbon tax, everybody in the country gets a check for $200 a month or $2,000 a year or $5,000 a year, depending on the size of the carbon tax. That once those types of things are in place, they'll be very hard to remove because people will like the idea of that. It basically becomes a guaranteed level of family income. And so it meshes together guaranteed income, which is a very progressive policy, with a carbon tax, which is climate-friendly policy. So I think the possibility is there. I'm not pessimistic about it. Does that answer your question, Walid?
Yes, yes, it's okay. I was wondering to hear more about the possible recycling and how we can compensate low-income household through the recycling of carbon tax.
Well, there's a very narrow economics implication, which is handing back the money dollar for dollar to all households in the country is not efficient because it forgoes the opportunity to lower other distortionary taxes. But of course, it's progressive or equitable in the sense that it redistributes income. And so there's a trade-off between income efficiency and equity, which is long recognized. Leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Atshunito, can you please just share with us any experience at the local level that you have in mind where local authorities was active in terms of promoting energy efficiency and addressing in the same time this distributional effect that we are talking about?
Okay. Well, we have conducted a survey to cities and regions this fall, and a lot of cities and regions are, you know, that for a lot of cities and regions, the top priority is to, regarding energy efficiency in building, is to help low-income people. I mean, to help the energy, tackle with the energy poverty and increase energy affordability by kind of, supporting the energy efficiency renovations for low-income households. So clearly, local authorities are kind of very, very keen about, how to, help, and these policy measures would somewhat help, regressive effects of, carbon policies, I think. In addition, regarding the specific case, I recall the case of British Columbia, Canada. They have this. They have developed a new building energy codes, statewide energy codes. So they streamlined the, municipal energy codes. At the same time, they set the targeting year, like 2032, to become net zero energy ready. And they create the vision, common vision with industries and key local stakeholders. So that the good thing here is that, for the industry to kind of, by allowing long lead time, industries can prepare for the, ambitious level of energy efficiency standard, and they can kind of test the technologies, apply technologies, and and also they need to kind of train their people too. So I think, creating a common vision, long-term vision, especially for stricter, regulation would be very important for the local authorities to achieve ambitious goals, I think.
Thank you very much. I would go for the question related to the energy poverty, because that one important aspect of this discussion. And my question is for you, Arik, again. I read in some of your papers that you are talking about that we have to move beyond average when evaluating the impact of policies. Insight from recent paper, for instance, on standards for car use and the need to consider policy impacts on the cooling and heating needs for different socioeconomic groups, such as old versus young, low, high income, etc. So, can you please elaborate further on this idea about going beyond average when evaluate policies?
Sure. Well, we're moving a little bit away from the building sector, but it's related sector is automobiles, and here it's harder to decarbonize without moving to all electric vehicles and a all electric grid. Historically, the United States had fuel economy standards, energy efficiency standards for cars, and Europe and the rest of the world had high gasoline taxes. And from an economics perspective, that was the right strategy. Since 2000, Europe, Japan, increasingly South America, have followed the United States' lead down energy efficiency standards. And the way those standards work, they're fleet-wide averages. So Toyota can sell as many gas guzzling cars as it wants in the United States, as long as it sells enough fuel efficient cars so that the average meets some standard. Now that has terrible incentives on individuals, because it means that if I go to try to buy a fuel efficient car, all I'm doing is enabling somebody else to buy a gas guzzling car. So I find that very dispiriting. The other thing that it does is it puts the cart before the horse. And this is true of all energy efficiency standards. It's partly a reaction to Brian's reaction to my reaction to his focus, scene setting. Raising the price of carbon will induce people to be energy efficient in places where that energy is carbon intensive. So in places where the electric grid is carbon intensive, the price of electricity will be high because of the price on carbon. And so I would want to go buy a fuel efficient car, and I would want to buy a energy efficient air conditioner. And in places where the grid is relatively renewable, the price of energy would be cheaper, and so I would direct my efforts towards, I would direct fewer efforts towards energy efficiency. And that would be good for the planet, because we'd be putting the energy efficient appliances in places where the grid is dirtiest. If instead we enact a standard that says all the toasters and all the air conditioners must be energy efficient, then they're going to places where they're less useful. We've, instead of incentivizing people to buy energy efficient appliances by making the price of energy high, we've required the appliances to be energy efficient, and people will go and all it does is make using them less expensive.
Thank you, Arik. Again, to stay on the energy poverty, we know that there is some determinant of energy poverty, which could be the low income, the geographical location, the age. Sometimes you have retired people living in a building without any good insulation and very weak energy efficiency, and they have to pay more. And even if they want to buy any equipment for their house, they cannot buy the most efficient way because it's the most expensive way. So they just buy something which cheaper, but at the same time in the lowest categories of energy efficiency. So yeah, we cannot today design any energy policy, energy efficiency policy, ignoring that, yeah, the energy efficiency will cost time, even there's a return of it. And sometimes we cannot realize that there's a return. And this, it's a behavioral bias, more mainly related to a myopia, in the sense that we look to the budget today and we have preference for to consume today, neither to say better to invest for tomorrow, having a machine which is more energy efficient, that will save money for tomorrow, but will cost a lot today. And this actually, for low-income people, is something that have to be taken in consideration. That's a reflection that I want to share with Brian, because I was reading your chapter in the word Energy Outlook about people-centered transition. And I want you actually just to develop further how we can make all this policy centered on people further, taking in consideration that when we talk about people, people are living in very, very heterogeneous contexts, having different class and different behavioral and culture. And that's why sometimes I want to, when we say people, we have to define what people are talking about exactly.
I think that's a key point, and I welcome the centrality we're all putting here on the distributional effects in these questions, because I think they're really important. They're important moral questions in themselves, but they're also central to the likelihood of succeeding in this project. And we see here in France that a couple of years ago the government tried to raise the price of gasoline and diesel a little bit and failed. And one of the reasons it failed, of course, is because those prices are felt more by rural people who are car dependent, don't have many public transport options like people like me who live in cities do. And that's a clear factor. And I think it's a pity when people, end up positioning these people as either pro-green, pro-environmental, or anti-green, anti-environmental. And that's part of the problem, is kind of like, let's say, moral grandstanding that sometimes happens. I'm not speaking about anyone in particular, in any particular case, but there is sometimes a sense of portraying certain people as anti-environmental because they don't accept certain policies or behave in certain ways. I think, Walid, you're absolutely right. We need to be a lot more subtle. And when we do that globally, it becomes even far more multidimensional, because I think energy poverty is a very specific, high priority policy issue that we need to urgently tackle, and need to recognize that it has many overlaps with clean energy transitions, but sometimes it doesn't entirely overlap. And if you think, I'll put energy access aside, which is probably in many ways a more urgent question for people who have no access to electricity or no access to clean cooking. But when we say energy poverty, we usually talk about people in parts of the world like this, where they live in homes that are not very efficient. They have appliances not very efficient. They can't afford to upgrade them, but they end up spending more of their income wasting energy through inefficient means. And it's a bit of a trap for those people, and it's rightly a policy priority in many governments' cases. Energy efficiency can really help, because there are many countries that maybe will, and I think it's probably, there's a very understandable reason, there's many countries that will subsidize the energy use of poorer people, but maybe the same money, condensed over time, could upgrade their home and massively reduce their energy bill, or it could help them buy more efficient appliances and massively reduce their energy bill. One has to be careful, because you can't just replace one policy with another and leave people in the lurch. On the other hand, energy efficiency is not, energy poverty alleviation is not entirely an energy efficiency measure, because people who live in energy poverty should use more energy. Because right now they can't afford, maybe they're all squashed in one room because they can't afford to heat the whole house, or they can only have electricity certain hours of the day because they can't pay their bills. That's not a desirable situation, and policy needs to address that urgently. If that household ends up using more energy because they can afford it, that's socially a very, very positive thing. Society as a whole can figure out how to deliver energy efficiency goals more broadly, but the burden shouldn't fall on people in those categories. And we need to recognize that there are different goals here. But energy efficiency can underpin those goals. And I think subtle policy making can do that. And I would commend, Hans in the Commission. I think Europe has some really excellent policies here and some excellent thinking about how to balance these factors. And I also very much agree with Hans's perspective on even in cases where energy prices are high and should act in theory as a much higher incentive for people to move towards efficiency, we know there are practical barriers, and you've mentioned them as well, Walid, whether it's about information or the time perspectives people put on things. That's where policy comes in to address these kind of barriers, you know, to solve these problems.
Thank you. Hans, could you just share with us any examples that you have from European Union programs about how we address energy poverty?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I mean, I think what has become increasingly clear in recent years is that there's a very, very strong connection between energy efficiency and energy poverty. And I'm not sure we were aware of that before, but I think that is now very, very clear. And I think what Brian just said is very right, that there are a lot of people who are unable actually to heat their buildings or their apartments up to the level they would want in the winter in order to keep warm. And for that reason, they might need to use more energy. But I think another way of looking at it is that they simply need to have better standards. They need to have a better insulated home. Then they can, maybe with the same amount of money that they are able to spend, heat their building up to the level where they are actually comfortable, also during cold spells at winter. So I think it's a very important, so to say, connection between energy poverty and energy efficiency. And I think we had a big discussion inside the Commission. I don't think I'm revealing too much by saying that. When we were sort of designing our big Fit for 55 package, so 55 here referring to the level of CO2 emissions reductions that we need by 2030. And we put forward this package by July of this year. And one element of that is to extend sort of carbon pricing that we currently have in a number of areas, to extend that to buildings and to transport, road transport. And that, of course, led to a discussion also inside the Commission about the social impacts of that. And I think that is right, because there are clearly implications and not necessarily the implications that we're looking at. We know that carbon pricing is effective, especially now that carbon price in Europe has risen to a level where it actually starts to matter. It works, it has an impact, and we would like to see that impact extended to those new sectors. But we also know that it could lead to, so we say, undesired effects, for example, people who live in energy poverty. And that's why we have the proposal also to create a social fund where part of the revenues from the carbon pricing can be channeled back into investment, especially aiming at addressing energy poverty and looking specifically at the needs of the people who are living in those type of conditions. So that's very important. But of course, energy poverty is an issue that we've been looking at now for some time, and we have some experience, as you say, Walid. We've created an energy poverty advisory hub, and we're now soon going to be starting to assist, I think, to begin with 80 individual municipalities in Europe, with direct support to scale up and broadly disseminate concrete solutions to help address energy poverty at the local level. And that's exactly inspired by things that we have already funded in the past. And there are a number of projects ongoing, for example, in Greece, but also in countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and elsewhere, in Czechia, in Italy, and in Poland as well. And these projects, they look at various aspects. They look at how we can establish energy communities, so basically trying to create, shall we say, associations of people who are living in energy poverty, and they can help each other, and we can try and create some kind of crowdfunding to ensure that energy poor citizens can have better access to energy, for example. We've also tried to look at people who live specifically in multifamily apartment buildings and make energy more affordable. And energy efficiency improvements in those areas are really critically important. So we have a number of examples that we can build on, but again, it's an area where I think we're learning as we move forward, and an area that is becoming increasingly important as we speak, actually.
Thank you, Hans. I would like to ask a question for all the speakers. The question is about knowledge gaps in the energy efficiency policy domains. So if each speaker can just tell us what are the priorities of gaps that we have to cover in terms of research, in terms of policy recommendation. From the OECD point of view, we are a forum of policy and governments to address different topics, and we would be very happy to hear from you what are these gaps and on which you think that the OECD can help. So I would start with Arik, please.
Sure, that's a great question, Walid. From my reading of the research on the topic, I don't think the low take-up of energy efficiency is due to knowledge gaps. There's an economist named Hunt Alcott who has done a lot of experiments where he intervened in stores and interrupted customers when they're about to buy a light bulb and explained all the gains of energy efficiency. And he intervened in customers when they're about to buy an automobile and helped explain all the benefits, future benefits of lower gasoline costs for people who bought automobiles. And that had very little effect on the take up of energy efficiency. And there have been a bunch of experiments done in the United States with subsidizing weatherization of homes for low income homeowners, and encouragement, giving literature, and even giving free thousands of dollars worth of benefits did not provoke a large take-up of the policies. And so I just don't think that it's an issue about people don't know about these issues.
Thank you, Arik. Hans?
We probably see it slightly differently, because I think it may be that people do not act upon it when they get the information, but they somehow are not always clear how they can act, because they still have certain needs and they want to fulfill those needs, and they're not quite sure how they can do it without doing what they are then initially intended on doing. So we think that there are knowledge gaps. I think there is still things that can be improved. For example, when it comes to buildings, it's true when you buy a house, at least in Europe, it comes with an energy certificate. Those energy certificates are far from clear. And once people then buy the home and they are doing an initial renovation before they actually move in, they might try and look at this, and then it's not really clear what it is they have to do, and they end up doing a rather artificial and not the kind of deep renovation that is really required. And I think there is a knowledge gap there, maybe not so much on what needs to be done, but how to do it. Actually, how is it that I get this? Can I, get some people in who can basically do this whole work for us? I mean, if we're focusing on buildings, which is, in our view, a really, really important part of this equation, I think there's a lot that can be done in order to facilitate how people can, in one go, have a really thorough and appropriate renovation in terms of energy consumption of their building in one go. So we think that there's a lot that can be done. And I mentioned earlier these so-called energy passports, which are one of the things that we're looking at in terms of the proposal coming out, hopefully before the end of the year, on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which sets out very, very clearly what needs doing and help people to identify the priorities and explain it very clearly to them you know, what are the benefits of doing it, what are the payback periods, and so on and so forth. And especially in the context of the rising energy prices that we're experiencing right now, I think that's something that people would actually appreciate quite a lot. So there are, in our view, a number of knowledge gaps that needs to be looked at. Can I just, while I have the floor, talk about just energy standards, because of course energy standards is one way of doing away with the need for, shall we say, information, because if you can have an energy standard that rules out placing on the market the worst performing types of appliances or equipment, it is a good thing. And we have been doing that through our eco design policy for many years in the EU. And our assessment is that this is actually responsible for up to 50% of the energy efficiency improvements that we have achieved in the last 10 years or so. So I think on that, we're not really at the point where we think we can do away with that kind of policy. I agree with what Arik has said, that one may need to look at the, shall we say, the social impacts of this, and whether this exactly addresses the way we want to do it. But it is a policy that we think is important, and we would like to continue doing it. And by the way, we think also it's something that can be replicated in many other parts of the world, and actually is replicated. So a lot of this can be done also at an international scale and not just at an EU level. I'll leave it there, Walid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. Mónica, the same question: knowledge gaps and what the OECD, how the OECD can help.
Yes, how I was saying before, in Chile, for example, the expertise of the professionals in energy efficiency is very important, because the private sector and this industry, the energy efficiency industry, the small one, are doing the most of the changes in energy efficiency here. They're changing not just the buildings, the private buildings or existing buildings, also the industry. So what I think is could be interesting to work with us is how to get the banking system to improve the finance of ESCOs. Those who offer a service focused in sustainability and promotes it with results. I mean, what we are doing and what we are showing the result to be the best client for those who give the short, medium, and long-term credit based on the climate change action. I mean, the authority doesn't understand specifically, or don't give really the big effort for energy efficiency, or doesn't understand how it works. So what we need, maybe, especially because we move in the private sector, is that the banks understand what we are doing, that maybe can be less difficult for us to go and to practice this energy efficiency in the industry and in the buildings. And the other thing that is we were talking before in this panel is must be is a cultural problem, and it's a big cultural problem to get, for example, a community in a building in agree. So we have really a lot to do in these things, and maybe it's something that you can help us also to give in some a few points or basic points how to confront this situation. So banks and cultural, how to keep a good agree in buildings. This is what I will say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mónica. That's very interesting insights indeed, and I think from our side, and I think my colleagues Brian and Othio share the same idea, that all these ideas are welcome, and we will think about it for our future program. I would also add maybe another knowledge gap that I think it's very important is in terms of behavioral science and how people behave when it comes to address or to react to different policy signals. Because when it comes to energy efficiency, this is one important aspect, because people may not see exactly if it's for interest for them, when, how, and how this can go. I know there's many experience around the world using nudging approach just to put the people in a position to react to those different policy. We are reaching the end of the session. I would like to thank you very much, all of you. It was a great session and the discussion very interesting. And thank you very much for the audience also. I would like just to do a reminder that we have another important session just at 3:35 Paris time. It's about greening medium and long distance transport. So please stay with us. Thank you very much.